How does a small city-state thrive in the shadow of colossal forces like Babylon and Egypt? Enter the Assyrian Empire, a civilization that started small, thinking big. This investigation into Ashur's rise shows how cunning strategy can rewrite the future, even against overwhelming odds. The origins of the Assyrian civilization can be traced back to the city of Ashur, tucked away on the west bank of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. This region, while less fertile than the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, offered unique advantages. Its location at the crossroads of significant trade routes linked Ashur to Anatolia, the Levant, and the southern cities of Sumer and Akkad. These connections allowed the Assyrians to carve out a space for themselves, not through overwhelming military conquest in their early days, but by becoming indispensable middlemen in the flow of goods and ideas across the ancient world. Ashur, however, was more than just a physical city. It stood under the divine protection of a god by the same name, Ashur, who would become central to the identity of this civilization. Early Assyrians believed their warrior deity directly guided the destiny of the city, a notion that would shape their outlook for centuries. Unlike the divine kings of Egypt or rulers like Hammurabi in Babylon, the Assyrian kings were not considered incarnations of gods. Instead, they were seen as mortal representations of Ashur, bound by their duty to honor and expand the god's domain. This dynamic created a society where militarism and religion were inseparable, laying the groundwork for the fierce and expansive empire to come. These early Assyrian kings held roles that reflected their city's hybrid identity. They were not just warriors, but also custodians of trade and religion. Functionally, they served as chief merchants and priest warriors, maintaining the delicate balance between Ashur's spiritual significance and its economic lifeblood. Long before massive armies and imperial grandeur, the people of Ashur thrived through trade deals and religious ceremonies, weaving their city's influence into a tapestry of regional interactions. Evidence for this comes from inscriptions that detail early commercial ventures as well as ritual dedications to their god, suggesting how deeply intertwined these roles were. However, what is especially fascinating about early Assyrian society is how it absorbed influences from its neighbors. The Hurrians, an ancient people from the mountains to the north, left their mark on Assyria's early identity. Their culture is evident not only in trade relationships, but also in the names of some of Ashur's earliest rulers, indicating a blending of traditions. Similarly, Amorite groups migrating from the west also shaped the cultural and political structure of early Assyria. This mix of influences highlights a theme that would define Assyria even at its imperial zenith. It was never a homogeneous entity, but a mosaic of cultures and ethnicities, bound together by its shared devotion to Ashur and the tenacity of its people. Despite its strategic position and cultural adaptability, Ashur's survival was never guaranteed. The city existed in a precarious environment alongside more powerful and often hostile neighbors, such as the Babylonian city-states to the south and the Mitanni kingdom to the west. Yet what the Assyrians lacked in size or strength, they made up for in resilience. Their terrain, characterized by rugged hills and fortified settlements, provided a natural layer of defense against invading forces, while the early Assyrians themselves ensured their longevity through a mix of diplomacy and stubborn self-reliance. They were survivors in every sense of the word, enduring through careful alliances when necessary and stubborn isolation when aggression threatened their independence. Interestingly, Ashur holds a unique place in history for its religious significance, one that openly contradicted the norms of the ancient world. Unlike the cities of Egypt or Babylon, where rulers proclaimed their divine right as gods incarnate, Ashur was consecrated entirely to the god it was named after. It existed not as a seat of royal divinity, but as a living temple under the direct care of mortal rulers. This focus on a divine city rather than divine kingship may seem abstract, but it carries profound implications. It meant that every act of governance, every treaty signed, or every resource managed was viewed as a sacred duty. Ashur's rulers expanded their city not for personal power, but to fulfill what they saw as the will of their god. By establishing this principle so early, the foundation was laid for the transformation of Assyria into a powerhouse driven by ideological as much as material ambition. The city of Ashur, then, was no ordinary settlement. While other civilizations of the time grew fat off vast agricultural surpluses or bristled with armies, Ashur thrived because it mastered a subtler game, leveraging location, influence, and belief. It was a city dedicated to a god, a trade hub that transcended its modest surroundings, and, most importantly, a seed from which a ferocious empire would one day sprout. Looking back, it's remarkable to consider how much of the later Assyrian identity, from its militarism to its multi-ethnic character, was already being quietly shaped in these formative years. Around 1900 BCE, the Assyrian state wasn't yet the military juggernaut of later centuries. Instead, it found its strength in something far less violent but no less influential: trade. Northern Mesopotamia, with its proximity to key overland routes, gave the Assyrians a rare opportunity to dominate the ancient economy. They extended their reach into Anatolia, establishing a sophisticated network of trading colonies that linked their hometown of Ashur with distant commercial hubs. Chief among these colonies was Kanesh, or Kultepe, in modern-day Turkey, a city that provides us with crucial insight into the economic engine of early Assyrian society. Kanesh served as the beating heart of this trade empire. Within the city, Assyrian merchants lived in a district known as the Karum, a term that signifies a market or trading quarter. These quarters were more than just rows of shops. They were vibrant enclaves where Assyrian traders owned houses, conducted deals, and stored goods. The merchants primarily exchanged textiles and tin, both products of immense value in the ancient world, for silver and gold. Tin, an indispensable resource for producing bronze, gave these traders a near monopoly in crafting one of the most sought-after materials of the time. The goods they moved weren't simply about survival. They fueled political alliances, ceremonial gift-giving, and the very infrastructure of early civilizations. What makes the Old Assyrian trading network so fascinating is the degree of independence it seemed to enjoy. These colonies were not militarized or controlled by the Assyrian government in a heavy-handed way. Instead, they operated autonomously, bound by mutual benefit and trust rather than armies or governors. The traders used a highly developed system of contracts and seals to record their transactions. These documents, painstakingly written on clay tablets, revealed complex private dealings where wealth was shared among family members back in Ashur who co-financed risky trade ventures. It's an early glimpse of what we might recognize as globalized commerce, a web of partnerships that extended far beyond borders. One extraordinary aspect of these trade colonies was the entrepreneurial role women played within them, particularly those back in Ashur. While society remained patriarchal, these women were not confined to passive roles. They oversaw the management of shipments, lent money to traders, and even engaged in lawsuits to defend their business interests. The thousands of tablets discovered in Kanesh mention women by name, documenting their active participation in shaping Assyria's early economy. This nuance challenges the typical narrative that ancient Mesopotamian women had limited agency, showing instead that Assyrian society left certain spheres of influence open to them. Perhaps even more striking was how the Assyrians handled the challenge of long-distance trade logistics. Instead of physically transporting massive sums of silver and gold, they pioneered one of the first known systems of long-distance credit. A merchant in Kanesh could borrow capital to fund a business venture and send profits back to Ashur without hauling heavy materials across dangerous roads. This innovation not only reduced risk, but also encouraged even larger transactions, further tightening the economic ties that linked Assyria to its trading partners. What's especially remarkable about this period is how the Assyrians avoided relying on military force to maintain their colonies. Unlike the empires that Assyria would later become famous for defeating, their early expansion relied on forming supportive local alliances. The traders integrated themselves into the cities where they worked, forming relationships that were based as much on trust and shared profit as on necessity. The merchants benefited from these arrangements, but so did the cities that hosted them, as evidenced by Kanesh's prosperity during this era. The discovery of over 23,000 cuneiform tablets in Kanesh has given historians a rare and detailed look into the economic lifeblood of the Old Assyrian period. These records don't just highlight their trading successes, they show how deeply commerce was embedded in the Assyrian identity. Even though the colony networks eventually collapsed, likely due to internal shifts and external pressures, the framework they built, one of strategic alliances, resource management, and profit-driven expansion, never disappeared. Later Assyrian kings would embrace a more militaristic approach, but echoes of these foundations would always remain. Profit, it seems, paved the way for plunder. By 1350 BCE, Assyria was still overshadowed by larger powers, but Ashur-uballit I changed that dramatically. At the time, the Mitanni kingdom dominated much of the northern Mesopotamian region, forcing Assyria into a subordinate role. But Ashur-uballit saw an opportunity to break these chains. Through military strength and calculated diplomacy, he seized control of his kingdom's destiny, elevating Assyria from a regional power to an emerging empire. One of Ashur-uballit's first significant moves was military. He launched a series of campaigns that undermined Mitanni authority, pushing their borders back and allowing Assyria a greater foothold in its home region. These campaigns didn't just expand territory, they sent a clear message to neighboring powers. Assyria was no longer content to play a secondary role. Ashur-uballit took advantage of shifting alliances and rivalries between the Mitanni, the Hittites, and Egypt. This power vacuum created by their competing interests gave him just enough room to secure Assyria's independence and initiate its first wave of territorial expansion. However, Ashur-uballit knew that military conquest alone wouldn't secure Assyria's place among the ancient world's great kingdoms. To legitimize Assyria's rise, he turned to diplomacy. He boldly assumed the title King of the Universe, a phrase long associated with rulers of global prestige like those in Babylon or the Hittite Empire. This declaration wasn't just symbolic. By claiming this title, Ashur-uballit set a precedent for Assyrian kings to see themselves not merely as regional rulers, but as universal sovereigns destined to dominate. His ambition extended far beyond titles. Ashur-uballit also wrote directly to the Egyptian pharaoh in the collection of diplomatic correspondences now known as the Amarna Letters. These letters revealed his audacious demand for recognition as an equal to the great powers of the day. In one particularly striking example, he negotiated for a diplomatic marriage, sending an Assyrian princess to Egypt to secure closer ties between the two kingdoms. The tone of his letters radiated confidence, a calculated move to position Assyria as a rising peer among the ancient world's giants. These exchanges marked Assyria's first true foray into the interregional diplomacy that would later define its imperial stature. But Ashur-uballit's ambitions didn't stop at displacing Mitanni dominance or forging foreign alliances. He redirected his attention to Babylon, sparking the first in what would become centuries of rivalry between the two cultures. During this period, Babylon was grappling with destabilization, and Ashur-uballit exploited this window to intervene in its internal politics. He orchestrated the rise of his grandson to the Babylonian throne, a bold attempt to extend Assyrian influence into one of the most prestigious kingdoms of the region. Tragically, this move backfired when the young king was assassinated, throwing Babylon into turmoil. Ashur-uballit responded with Assyria's first documented military involvement in Babylon, an event that underscored the unpredictable and volatile relationship that would mark future interactions between the two powers. What Ashur-uballit ultimately ignited was a shift in Assyrian identity. Before his reign, the Assyrians were survivors, traders, builders, and skilled diplomats navigating a dangerous regional landscape. Under his rule, they transformed into a people with imperial ambition at their core. This pivot was not just about expansion, it was about redefining how Assyria saw itself. By challenging regional superpowers, asserting his status among elite monarchs, and wielding both the pen and the sword, Ashur-uballit set a blueprint for what Assyria would become. His campaigns, titles, and treaties lay the first stepping stones for the centuries of dominance that would later define the empire. For a kingdom that had long been boxed in by stronger neighbors, this was Assyria's first brush with imperialism. Ashur-uballit's reign revealed that their survival was no longer enough. The Assyrians were beginning to dream much bigger. In the Middle Assyrian period, roughly between the 14th and 11th centuries BCE, Assyria developed a legal system that reflected the growing power and ruthless pragmatism of the state, the Middle Assyrian Law Code. Unlike the earlier and often idealized Code of Hammurabi, which framed law as a reflection of moral order balanced by justice, the Assyrian counterpart operated on an entirely different premise. Here, the law wasn't about fairness, it was about control. It retained an overtly brutal character, using harsh punishments to reinforce authority, discourage disobedience, and maintain a society built around hierarchy and fear. The punishments prescribed by the Middle Assyrian Code were stark, often involving mutilation, death, or prolonged physical suffering. Crimes that might warrant a fine in other ancient legal traditions could lead to the loss of a hand, an eye, or even a tongue in Assyria. These punishments weren't always about the gravity of the crime, but about making examples of those who transgress the rigid boundaries of Assyrian society. For rulers, this legal violence was both functional and symbolic. By enforcing extreme consequences for breaking the rules, they emphasized that the king's order was absolute and unchallengeable. Law became synonymous with discipline, and discipline was maintained through fear. The Middle Assyrian legal system also entrenched strict gender disparities within its punishments. Women, in particular, faced some of the hardest prescriptions under the code. Adultery, defiance of a husband's authority, or other perceived transgressions brought severe public humiliation and even physical mutilation. For instance, a woman convicted of adultery could be subjected to being paraded naked or mutilated, acts of deliberate spectacle designed to reinforce her subservient status in a patriarchal society. The law even allowed husbands to carry out some of these punishments themselves, but, and this detail is striking, only with the king's explicit permission. This condition tied even the private sphere of marital relationships to the authority of the state, showing how thoroughly the Assyrian kings sought to extend their control over everyday life. Yet the brutality of these laws wasn't limited to the household or women's behavior. The code also regulated matters of war, land, and contracts, reflecting the broader militaristic structure of the Assyrian state. Soldiers, for example, were held to strict standards. Desertion or disobedience in the army could lead to immediate execution, often without ceremony. Land tenure was heavily dictated by royal authority, with severe repercussions for anyone who mishandled or misused property tied to a king. Even slaves, a vulnerable group in any society, faced legal oversight. Their treatment, as outlined in the code, was protected only insomuch as it benefited the state economy, revealing how Assyrian law viewed individuals as little more than cogs in the larger imperial system. Despite its cruelty, the Middle Assyrian Code served an essential purpose within the empire. It centralized authority by standardizing laws across Assyrian territory, ensuring a uniform system of governance that left little room for local improvisation. In a world where empires often juggled diverse populations and customs, this deliberate systemization was a means to impose unity where it didn't naturally exist. The legal code wasn't just a set of punishments, it was also a performance of power. Every trial, every punishment administered publicly, and every dictated regulation reinforced the image of a state that did not tolerate weakness or leniency. On the surface, this draconian system might seem to suggest chaos or cruelty for its own sake. But it functioned as a finely tuned mechanism for projecting stability in an environment defined by constant threats both from within and beyond Assyrian borders. In this, the code mirrored the values of the empire: discipline over compassion, order over fairness, power above all else. And at its core was the unmistakable hand of the king, who demanded control even over the small, brutal details of individual lives. Tukulti-Ninurta I claimed his place in Assyrian history with an act that shook the ancient world: the Conquest of Babylon. Reigning in the 13th century BCE, he became the first Assyrian king to bring Babylon, a symbol of southern dominance and culture, under Assyrian control. This victory was more than strategic, it was symbolic. For centuries, Babylon had been a focal point of Mesopotamian power, a kingdom that Assyria had looked toward with both envy and reverence. By taking Babylon, Tukulti-Ninurta sent a clear message that Assyria was no longer an outsider in the narrative of Mesopotamia. It was poised to lead it. The conquest itself was brutal. Tukulti-Ninurta not only captured the city, but also plundered it in ways that outraged its people and neighboring states. One act stood out above all. He seized the statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, and transported it to Assyria. In Mesopotamian belief, a city's god was its protector, its source of identity and legitimacy. To remove that god was to hollow out the city's soul. The act was seen as sacrilege, a violation not just of Babylon, but of the sacred traditions that bound the region together. To the Babylonians, it was an affront. To Tukulti-Ninurta, it was a statement. By taking Marduk's statue, he claimed not only Babylon's lands, but also its spiritual heritage, positioning Assyria as the true heir to the divine legacy of Mesopotamia. Tukulti-Ninurta's vision of empire stretched beyond swords and plunder. He styled himself as a divine agent, acting under the god's direction to bring order and greatness to the world. His inscriptions and commissioned works portrayed him not only as a conqueror, but also as a scholar and a chosen ruler. This dual image, a warrior king with scholarly ambitions, was central to how he legitimized his expanded realm. He even oversaw the composition of epic poems glorifying his reign, creating some of the earliest examples of literary propaganda. These writings elevated his conquest to acts of divine destiny, reinforcing his authority across the empire. Flush with his achievements, Tukulti-Ninurta decided to immortalize his greatness by founding a new capital, Tukulti-Ninurta. Located across the Tigris River from Ashur, this city was meant to embody his might and vision. It included a temple dedicated to Ashur, palaces, and towering structures designed to rival the splendor of any Mesopotamian city. But his ambition outpaced his people's faith in him. The new capital failed to foster loyalty, and after his death, it was quickly abandoned, remaining a stark reminder that legacy isn't built on monuments alone. Despite his successes, Tukulti-Ninurta's reign unraveled in its later years. His harsh methods alienated not only his enemies, but also his own court and priesthood. This growing discontent culminated in his assassination. According to later sources, his own sons conspired to kill him, possibly while he was praying in a temple, a poetic and tragic end for a king who had portrayed himself as the gods' chosen ruler. His death, steeped in betrayal, reflected the instability his ambition had sown within his own empire. Even in death, Tukulti-Ninurta's legacy endured, for better or worse. His sack of Babylon ignited a centuries-long rivalry between Assyria and Babylon, one marked by cycles of conquest and revenge. The looting of Marduk's statue burned itself into Babylonian memory, casting Assyria less as a rightful heir and more as a plundering aggressor. Tukulti-Ninurta's reign showed how ambition could both elevate and destroy, leaving a blueprint filled with both triumph and caution for the kings who would follow him. Around 1200 BCE, the ancient world faced a collapse that shattered nearly every corner of the Near East. The mighty Hittite Empire vanished from history. Mycenaean cities across the Aegean crumbled into ruins, and Egypt barely held on, its borders buckling under relentless waves of invasions and internal strife. Yet, amidst this widespread turmoil, Assyria managed something remarkable: survival. Though far from unscathed, it weathered the chaos and emerged stronger, adapting to challenges that proved fatal to so many of its neighbors. The period was no less challenging for Assyria. Internal rebellions destabilized its core, and on the western frontiers, nomadic Aramean tribes surged in waves of raids and incursions. These Arameans exploited the weakness left by larger powers collapsing around them, disrupting trade routes and threatening the fringes of Assyria's territory. Internally, economic stability wavered under the pressure of diminished regional commerce and the broad disruptions of the time. Yet, unlike the Hittites in the north or the Mycenaeans to the west, Assyria didn't collapse into irrelevance. Instead, it deliberately chose to retreat and regroup, a strategy that allowed it to endure when others fell. Rather than overstretch its resources, Assyria contracted strategically. Its rulers reinforced the heart of the kingdom, including key cities like Ashur and the lesser-known Ninurta. These fortified strongholds served as bastions of protection during the storm. The empire focused on preserving its core territory instead of overextending in pursuit of ambitious military campaigns. This approach provided the breathing room needed to rebuild and allowed Assyria to adopt a long-term strategy for recovery. The strength of its institutions played a critical role. Data from temple archives indicate that regional governance and the mechanisms of administration remained intact, even as external pressures mounted. The machine of Assyrian statecraft not only slowed, but survived. This era also saw a decentralization of sorts, as smaller Assyrian-linked states emerged. Hanagalbat, one such region, retained the military traditions and cultural practices of Assyria while operating with more localized autonomy. These fragmented but resilient offshoots didn't signify the decline of Assyria's influence, but instead acted as reservoirs of Assyrian identity, all while preserving the military ethos and organizational structures that would later fuel the empire's resurgence. These smaller regional states served as springboards, enabling future expansion once broader stability returned to the Near East. Culturally, Assyria's foundation didn't crumble, even when pieces of its structures cracked. In fact, some of the most important elements of Assyrian intellectual life continued through this turbulent era. Temple scribes remained active, copying texts and maintaining archives of historical, religious, and legal documents. In a time when writing was disappearing elsewhere, the famous collapse of literacy seen across much of the ancient world, Assyria's scribes ensured that the cuneiform tradition endured. They laid intellectual groundwork that later scholars, like those of Ashurbanipal's reign, would elevate into larger cultural achievement. While the world forgot how to write, Assyria held a pen. It's tempting to credit Assyria's survival in the Bronze Age collapse to luck, but nothing about their endurance was accidental. They adapted to the shifting dynamics of the region, fortified what was essential, and drew on their deep traditions of military organization and ideological commitment to empire. Assyrian rulers didn't see the chaos around them as an end. They saw it as a test. That belief in their imperial destiny, reinforced by practical decisions, allowed them to outlast civilizations many thought were far more impressive. By surviving this crucible, Assyria not only endured, but also set the stage for its eventual transformation into an empire that would dominate the Near East for centuries to come. In the 9th century BCE, Ashurnasirpal II ascended the Assyrian throne and reshaped his kingdom into a force defined by fear, spectacle, and relentless expansion. At a time when Assyria was recovering from its past struggles, he introduced a reign that would come to symbolize the empire's return to dominance. Through cunning military strategy and chilling brutality, Ashurnasirpal II established Assyria as a state unmatched in its ability to terrify opponents into submission. The king led numerous campaigns beyond his borders, targeting regions in the Levant and Anatolia, key areas rich in resources and strategic value. However, Ashurnasirpal's victories weren't remembered merely for their success. They were immortalized by the sheer horror they left behind. His inscriptions graphically detailed the aftermath of battles, defeated enemies impaled on stakes lining city walls, captives flayed alive, and entire populations massacred or sold into slavery. These acts weren't just brutal, they were intentional performances, crafted to leave a psychological mark on both the living and the dead. His victims were spectacle as much as casualties. For those contemplating rebellion or resistance, the message was clear. Assyria would not just bring destruction, but annihilation. But Ashurnasirpal's strategy went beyond the battlefield. He understood that terror alone couldn't sustain an empire. To reinforce Assyria's dominance, he turned to propaganda in its most monumental form, rebuilding and transforming the city of Kalhu, modern-day Nimrud, into his new imperial capital. While Kalhu had existed as a modest settlement for centuries, Ashurnasirpal envisioned it as a testament to Assyrian might. He constructed a grand palace adorned with intricate reliefs boasting of his military triumphs and divine favor. Gigantic winged Lamassu statues with the bodies of bulls and the faces of men towered at gateways to emphasize the city's overwhelming strength. Kalhu wasn't just a seat of power, it was an ideological statement. Its architecture and art were designed to intimidate. Walking through its vast halls, lined with carved depictions of Ashurnasirpal's victories, visitors and subjects alike would confront a vivid reminder of the king's authority. Every brick, every carving was a tool of control, reinforcing the message that Assyria's reach was as enduring as it was merciless. Central to his reign was a policy of systematic deportation. Conquered peoples were uprooted from their homelands and resettled across Assyrian territories. This forced migration accomplished several goals. It broke the cultural and political ties among those who might resist, it diluted local identities, and it provided labor for Assyrian infrastructure projects. These displaced communities built the empire they feared, laying roads, constructing cities, and fueling the agricultural output needed to sustain Assyria's growing appetite for conquest. It was a calculated move, empire not just expanding, but restructuring populations to serve its needs. Ironically, for all his reputation as a brutal oppressor, Ashurnasirpal was also a patron of culture and innovation. The Assyrian art and architecture he encouraged became distinctive hallmarks of the empire. His courts saw advances in engineering, irrigation, and craftsmanship, many of which supported imperial ambitions. Despite his reputation for terror, Ashurnasirpal knew that an empire's blood-stained borders only succeed if its heart pulsed with careful planning and cultural investment. In what may have been his most audacious display of power, Ashurnasirpal reportedly hosted a massive 10-day feast to commemorate the grand opening of Kalhu. Nearly 70,000 people attended, including nobles, foreign dignitaries, and laborers. Lavish quantities of food and drink flowed, a calculated gesture designed to demonstrate not just Assyria's wealth, but its ability to gather and promote on an imperial scale. The banquet wasn't just a celebration, but a display of dominance, its splendor reinforcing the idea that even after the destruction he wrought, Ashurnasirpal could sustain, build, and flourish. Ashurnasirpal II didn't simply rule. He engineered an empire that ran on calculated fear and awe. His reign marked a turning point, where terror wasn't just a byproduct of conquest, but the principle around which Assyrian strategy revolved. Through death, displacement, and architectural splendor, he declared unequivocally that resistance to Assyria was both futile and unforgivable. It was this balance of cruelty and capability, destruction and construction, that turned Assyria into a force poised to dominate the ancient Near East for generations. Kalhu, known today as Nimrud, became the ultimate expression of Assyria's growing imperial ambition under Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BCE. It wasn't merely a city, it was a statement, a symbolic and literal foundation for the empire's power. Rebuilt as the heart of a new Assyrian age, Kalhu stood as an overwhelming reminder to both subjects and enemies of the king's reach. Every detail, every corner of the capital served a purpose: to awe, control, and intimidate. At the center of Kalhu's design stood the massive Northwest Palace, a sprawling complex that housed Ashurnasirpal II's court. Its scale alone demanded attention. The walls of the palace were covered with intricate carvings, reliefs that depicted the king as both a divine agent and a mortal force of nature. In these images, gods bestowed their blessings on him while defeated enemies were trampled beneath his feet. These powerful visuals reinforced the core belief of Assyrian kingship, that their authority was not human, but cosmic, ordained by the gods themselves. Guarding the entrances to the palace were the colossal winged Lamassu statues, part bull, part eagle, and part human. Each one weighed over 10 tons and was carved with impeccable precision, their otherworldly forms intended to visually separate the mundane from the divine. To stand before them was to feel the overwhelming presence of the king's divine mandate. Even today, How these statues were transported and installed is a mystery that eludes modern engineering. Yet, Kalhu wasn't simply about monumental structures. The city was intentionally crafted as a multi-layered hub of power. Administrative zones were dispersed throughout the city, ensuring the bureaucracy could function efficiently at the epicenter of the empire. Surrounding the city were garrisons to house and manage troops ready to be deployed across Assyria's vast territories. Massive storehouses, designed to hold grain and resources collected as tribute, emphasized the empire's wealth and the logistical order needed to sustain its conquests. Kalhu wasn't just built to govern, it was built to dominate. One of the most remarkable features of Kalhu, however, was its deliberate display of imperial abundance. The city included a zoo and botanical gardens, showcasing exotic animals like lions, elephants, and monkeys, along with rare plants brought from distant lands. These collections didn't merely highlight Assyria's geographical reach, they reflected the idea that the king not only controlled people, but nature itself. A walk through the gardens or a glimpse of the captive animals reminded Assyrians and foreign visitors alike that Ashurnasirpal's power extended far beyond Assyrian borders. The uniformity of Kalhu's style represented another first, the standardization of Assyrian art. Carvings, inscriptions, and designs adhered to specific visual rules, creating a clear and consistent message throughout the city. Patterns of repeated imagery, such as the winged disk of the god Ashur or prisoners paraded before the king, cemented themes of divinely supported conquest and eternal order. This visual grammar of power became a hallmark not just of Kalhu, but of the Neo-Assyrian Empire as a whole, shaping its identity for generations. But Kalhu wasn't just about administration or aesthetics. It was psychological warfare in stone. The city was designed to overwhelm the senses and crush the will. For anyone entering Kalhu, whether an allied dignitary paying tribute or a captive brought in chains, the message was the same. This was the center of the world. Kalhu projected Assyrian dominance with every statue, inscription, and fortified wall. It served not only as the capital of an empire, but as a constant reminder that Assyria was governed by divine will and reinforced through absolute force. Ashurnasirpal had created more than a city. He had built a warning. Shalmaneser III ruled Assyria from 859 to 824 BCE, carving his legacy into history not through a single defining moment, but through the sheer, relentless volume of his military campaigns. For 35 years, he waged nearly constant war, directing the Assyrian war machine in every direction imaginable. From the rugged mountains of Anatolia to the desert cities of the Levant, his armies moved with unrelenting purpose, expanding Assyria's political reach and reinforcing its reputation as a state in permanent motion. One of Shalmaneser's most significant clashes occurred in 853 BCE at the Battle of Karkar, a pivotal confrontation etched into the pages of Near Eastern history. Facing him was not a single kingdom, but a massive coalition of regional powers, a rare alliance of Levantine rulers that included King Hadadezer of Damascus, King Ahab of Israel, and smaller states such as Hamath. This united front fielded a diverse army that combined infantry, chariots, and cavalry, all aiming to halt Assyria's advance. According to Shalmaneser's own inscriptions, he emerged victorious, claiming that he inflicted heavy losses on the coalition forces and drove them from the field. However, modern historians, while acknowledging the scale of the battle, often question whether this victory resulted in tangible gains for Assyria. What isn't in doubt is that Shalmaneser made sure this moment was immortalized, as much for its propaganda value as for its military significance. Shalmaneser's reign coincided with the proliferation of monumental art as a key tool of Assyrian statecraft, and few artifacts capture his military and political might better than the famous Black Obelisk. This four-sided stone monument celebrates his conquests in vivid detail, with carved panels showing subjugated kings bowing before him and presenting tribute. Perhaps the most famous panel depicts a kneeling figure believed to be King Yehu of Israel, or possibly a diplomatic envoy representing him, offering gifts in submission. This image isn't just one of Assyria's greatest propagandistic triumphs, it's also the earliest known depiction of an Israelite ruler, making it a critical artifact connecting the histories of Assyria and the biblical world. Exemplifies how Shalmaneser blurred the lines between history and propaganda. Whether or not his campaigns achieved their intended goals, their portrayal in stone declared success as a foregone conclusion. This was no accident. The narrative of Assyrian strength relied heavily on visual and textual records that framed all opposition as doomed before Assyria's might. The inscriptions and carvings weren't just retrospective boasts. They were warnings to both internal and external audiences that Assyria's power was backed by divine will and unstoppable force. Yet the demands of constant warfare took their toll. The campaigns drained resources, taxed the loyalty of provincial officials, and exposed the limits of Assyrian control. By the final years of Shalmaneser's reign, the strain became apparent. Revolts erupted within the empire, including one led by his own son, marking internal fractures that would carry into the next generation. Shalmaneser remained on the throne, but the later years of his rule illustrate the cost of maintaining an empire that thrived on perpetual conquest. Shalmaneser III may not have achieved the lasting territorial gains of some of his successors, but his reign solidified an imperial expectation that became central to the Assyrian identity. Expansion had to be constant, and conquest was the state's lifeblood. By normalizing endless campaigns and reinforcing power through propaganda on an unprecedented scale, he laid the foundation for an empire that needed to rest. His Black Obelisk stands as both a testament to his ambition and a reminder of how the Assyrian idea of empire was built, one relentless strike after another. In 745 BCE, Assyria was in turmoil. Regional governors had become power-hungry, turning their territories into semi-independent states. The once mighty kingdom was fracturing, and its borders were shrinking under external pressures. Then came Tiglath-Pileser III, a man who didn't just seize the throne, but seized an opportunity to reshape the very essence of Assyria. Taking power in what was likely a coup, he ushered in reforms so profound they would redefine empire building. Tiglath-Pileser III recognized that leaving regional rulers unchecked was a recipe for disaster. His solution? He reorganized the state into a series of centrally controlled provinces. These provinces were ruled by governors personally appointed by the king, loyal only to him, instead of the old hereditary vassals who tended to act with dangerous autonomy. This shift gutted the power of the aristocracy, tying the governance of these territories directly to the throne. It was the end of nobles ruling like independent kings and the beginning of a tightly run bureaucracy. However, reorganization wasn't enough. Tiglath-Pileser knew that Assyria's survival and dominance depended on military strength. Under his leadership, Assyria's armies transformed from part-time semi-professional forces into one of the world's first fully professional standing armies. Every soldier served year-round and as a specialist. Archers who rained precise volleys, charioteers devastating on open plains, and even engineers capable of breaching fortified cities with advanced siege tools became cornerstones of the new Assyrian military. Cavalry, still a relatively new idea for warfare, was incorporated to increase speed and mobility, keeping Assyria ahead on every battlefield. War turned from seasonal raiding to an ongoing systematic expansion of control. But Tiglath-Pileser III didn't just conquer through battle. His policy of mass deportation became a chilling hallmark of his reign. Entire populations were uprooted and forcibly relocated. Unlike previous practices of deporting elites or war captives alone, Tiglath-Pileser scaled this process to an unprecedented degree. Cities stripped of their populations could no longer muster rebellion, while relocated Assyrians and deportees were resettled in strategically important regions, ensuring loyalty and productivity where it mattered the most. By displacing tens of thousands, he not only broke the spirit of resistance, but also reshaped Assyria's demographic map to cement control. His campaigns were relentless and methodical. Under Tiglath-Pileser's rule, vast swaths of territory across Babylonia, Syria, and the Levant were annexed, not as tributary states, but as integral parts of the Assyrian Empire. Systematic administration extended into these newly conquered lands, ensuring that no region was simply left on the periphery. It was a revolutionary approach, one of transforming acquired lands into true provinces rather than loose vassals who owed little beyond fealty and tribute. As much as he was a reformer and military tactician, Tiglath-Pileser III was also a master of propaganda. He understood the power of perception and worked tirelessly to present himself as a divinely sanctioned ruler. His inscriptions often described him as a restorer of order, chosen by the gods to save Assyria from chaos, even as his methods left a trail of brutality. Entire cities were annihilated under his orders, their leaders executed, and local elites replaced with loyal Assyrians. Yet, in his records, Tiglath-Pileser styled himself as a savior, a restorer of harmony. This strategy extended to his relationship with Babylonia, which had long been the cultural and religious heart of Mesopotamia. Rather than treating it simply as a conquest, Tiglath-Pileser III elevated his status by declaring himself King of Babylon. In doing so, he not only annexed the southern region militarily, but wove it symbolically into the fabric of his rule. Assyria and Babylonia were united under one crown, a move that challenged established hierarchies and reinforced Assyria's dominance. The reforms Tiglath-Pileser undertook, the professional military, centralization of power, administrative integration, and bold use of optics, laid the groundwork for Assyria's coming golden age. Before his reign, Assyria was a fractured kingdom, mired in internal strife and shrinking borders. By the time of his death, it had become a centralized, unified, and expansionist power. His work didn't just revive Assyria, it made Tiglath-Pileser III one of the ancient world's most transformative rulers. By the time Tiglath-Pileser III had finished reshaping Assyria into a centralized powerhouse, his successors were ready to put his systems to the ultimate test of longevity. Conquering a land was one thing, keeping it loyal, managed, and productive was another. What set Assyria apart was its ability to institutionalize conquest, turning each new territory into a fully integrated piece of the empire. The process wasn't improvised, it was systematic, calculated, and built to last. Central to this strategy was the division of conquered regions into provinces. Each new province was placed under the authority of an Assyrian governor, known as a Saknu. Unlike the traditional system of leaving loyal local rulers in power, one who might one day rebel, the Assyrian-appointed governors reported directly to the king. This ironclad hierarchy eliminated much of the autonomy that had destabilized earlier empires. To ensure compliance, Governors not only managed local resources, but oversaw Assyrian garrisons stationed in their jurisdictions. These permanent military outposts acted as both deterrents and rapid response units, capable of quelling uprisings before rebellion could take root. This transformed every province into not just a conquered land, but an extension of the Assyrian military-industrial complex. Another cornerstone of Assyrian control was their use of mass deportations, which reached a scale unprecedented in the ancient world. Entire cities and regions were depopulated and reorganized under state direction. The motive wasn't just cruel punishment. These deportations had a strategic purpose. Skilled workers, artisans, and farmers were frequently resettled in different provinces to both exploit their labor and weaken any sense of unified local identity. The relocation of rebellious elites to distant lands also left conquered territories politically docile. While such relocations might seem chaotic, they were anything but. Experts in logistics planned transport routes, food supplies, and settlement procedures, often moving tens of thousands of people at a time. Administrative documents even detailed the supplies rationed to deportees, underscoring the organized yet coldly efficient nature of the enterprise. What made this system especially effective was its ability to transform the population on both ends of the process. In areas that had been emptied by deportations, Assyrians resettled, creating loyal communities of settlers who bolstered imperial authority. For those who were forcefully resettled, the separation from their homeland often fragmented cultural and political ties, making collective resistance or rebellion nearly impossible. But in some cases, deported populations managed to retain elements of their identity. Archaeological evidence reveals that some communities clung to their languages and religious practices for generations, despite living under direct Assyrian rule. These cultural remnants serve as a testament to human resilience, though not enough to disrupt the Assyrian stranglehold over daily life. This dual approach of destabilizing conquered territories and integrating useful populations was supported by the empire-wide infrastructure. Roads, canals, and storage depots crisscrossed Assyria's holdings, ensuring the military could move swiftly while also enabling the flow of goods and tribute to the heart of the empire. Garrisons ensured no part of the empire was ever out of the king's reach, while an extensive spy network kept the governors and officials under constant surveillance. Even the highest-ranking provincial leaders knew they were being watched, which stamped out any notions of personal ambition. Assyria's methods weren't just effective in their time, they served as models for the empires that followed. Babylon, Persia, and even Rome drew from the Assyrian playbook, borrowing aspects like central appointed governors and the use of infrastructure to maintain control. In many ways, Assyria didn't just conquer cities, it wrote the manual for empire building itself. Its ruthless efficiency and obsession with control shifted the idea of conquest from temporary dominance to enduring governance, setting a standard that would echo across centuries of imperial history. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel faced its breaking point. For years, it had resisted Assyrian dominance, paying tribute under duress while rebellions simmered beneath the surface. That rebellion finally erupted in full force, prompting Shalmaneser V, the Assyrian king, to respond with overwhelming force. His armies marched southward, laying siege to Samaria, Israel's capital, in a campaign that would stretch over 3 long years. When the city finally fell, it marked not only the collapse of the northern kingdom, but also the beginning of one of ancient history's most infamous disappearances, the so-called 10 Lost Tribes of Israel. The population of Samaria, along with much of Israel's elite, was forcibly deported, scattered across the vast reaches of the Assyrian Empire. These deportees were resettled in far-flung provinces such as Media and the upper Mesopotamian regions, where they were carefully integrated into new communities. The Assyrian strategy was deliberate. By uprooting entire populations, they aimed to break the cultural and political identities that might fuel future rebellions. In Israel's case, this process was devastatingly effective. The 10 northern tribes, once central to the kingdom's identity, disappeared from the historical record as cohesive groups, earning their place in legend but not in history. What happened next defined Assyria's dominance in the Levant. In place of the deported Israelites, Assyria resettled individuals from other conquered regions. These new populations, brought from as far as Babylon and Syria, weren't allowed to preserve their own political ambitions. Instead, they were woven into a tapestry of Assyrian rule, creating multi-ethnic provinces that owed their identity to the empire. By mixing people of different languages and traditions, Assyria minimized the risk of unified resistance. Over time, this process of relocation and integration led to the complete erasure of Israel as an independent political entity. But the takeover wasn't just a matter of population control. It extended into every facet of public life. Assyrian gods replaced local deities, with temples and rituals rededicated to figures like Ashur and Ishtar. The administration required the use of the Assyrian language for official purposes, and art forms from Samaria began to echo Assyrian styles in their imagery and motifs. This phenomenon wasn't limited to Israel. Across the Levant, from Tyre to Philistia, Assyrian culture gradually reshaped local societies, creating a shared imperial identity that revolved around Assyria's dominance. For those states still clinging to their independence, like the southern kingdom of Judah, as well as cities like Tyre and Sidon, the message was clear: submission or destruction. Lachish, a fortified city in Judah, became an infamous example of the consequences of defiance. Assyrian wall reliefs vividly depict its siege, with battering rams smashing through the city's gates, soldiers storming its walls, and prisoners marched off into exile. Survivors were shown impaled or flayed, while the walls of Lachish burned, a chilling illustration of what happened to those who resisted Assyrian rule. This entire campaign reflects a fascinating historical convergence. The fall of Israel is one of the few major events chronicled by both Assyrian sources and the Hebrew Bible. Assyrian inscriptions celebrate the empire's victory, listing mountains of tribute and the capture of entire populations. Meanwhile, the Bible presents the story from the perspective of the defeated, framing Assyria as a divine instrument of punishment for Israel's supposed sins. Together, these accounts provide a rare glimpse of ancient events through the eyes of both victor and victim, creating a richer, albeit haunting, historical picture. By the time Assyria was finished in the Levant, the region had been irrevocably transformed. A patchwork of independent kingdoms gave way to tightly controlled provinces, all firmly integrated into the empire's administration and economy. The political map of the region had been redrawn, and so too had its cultural and religious identities. What had once been a mosaic of distinct nations was now a cohesive, albeit forcibly molded, part of the Assyrian imperial core. Sargon II's ascent to power in 722 BCE was shrouded in uncertainty. He claimed the throne after the death of Shalmaneser V, but historians suspect his path to the crown may have involved a coup. This tumultuous beginning did not deter him. Instead, he cemented his legitimacy through military campaigns and sweeping reforms that would expand Assyria to new heights. In a reign defined by ambition, Sargon sought not only to govern the world, but to also reshape it in his vision, one of total control and order. One of Sargon's first challenges came from within. Babylonia, a region infamous for its volatility, had aligned itself with Elam, a powerful kingdom to the east. Not content to let southern Mesopotamia slip out of Assyrian hands, Sargon marched his enemies south, crushed Babylonia's resistance, and declared himself king of Babylon. By taking this dual title, he followed in Tiglath-Pileser III's footsteps, asserting not only military dominance, but also symbolic unity between Assyria and its culturally prestigious southern rival. This victory marked the start of his broader ambitions. From there, Sargon turned his attention to Israel, the Levant, and Anatolia, all regions simmering with unrest. After the fall of Samaria under Shalmaneser V, Sargon dealt with remaining revolts in the area, including resistance in Gaza, where he faced Egyptian-backed rebels. He decisively defeated them, extending Assyrian power deeper into the Levant and eventually as far west as parts of Cyprus. For Sargon, these campaigns were about more than land. They were about ensuring that no region, however distant, could challenge his authority. Perhaps the most grueling of his campaigns occurred in the kingdom of Urartu, located in the rugged mountain ranges of eastern Anatolia. Urartu had long been a thorn in Assyria's side, strategically positioned to block northern trade routes and launch repeated raids into Assyrian territories. Sargon's campaign against Urartu was a brutal one, marked by ambushes, treacherous terrain, and harsh winters. Yet, he prevailed, weakening Urartu and incorporating parts of its land into the empire. These victories, however hard-earned, solidified Assyrian dominance at its widest territorial extent to date. But Sargon's ambitions extended beyond the battlefield. To symbolize his power and vision of imperial order, he began constructing a new capital, Dur-Sharrukin, or Fortress of Sargon. Located in the heartland of Assyria, this city was meticulously planned and built, with separate zones for administration, military storage, and common residential areas. This urban design, centuries ahead of its time, reflected not only a sense of control, but also an obsession with organization. The city's massive walls and ornate palace underscored Sargon's desire to present himself as a divinely chosen ruler. Yet, despite its grandeur, Sargon would never see the completion of his masterpiece. Before construction was finished, he took to the battlefield one last time. Sargon's death in 705 BCE during a military campaign was a stark break from tradition. Most Assyrian kings died in their palaces, but Sargon fell on foreign soil, possibly against the Cimmerians, a nomadic group from the north. His body was never recovered, a deeply unsettling event in an empire where the king's fate symbolized divine favor. This loss threw the empire into a wave of anxiety, with many believing the gods had turned against Assyria. It also left his successor, Sennacherib, with the unenviable task of restoring confidence in the empire's destiny. Yet Sargon's legacy, though cut short, remains remarkable. His reign symbolized the zenith of Assyrian ambition, territorial, cultural, and administrative. He merged militaristic prowess with a deeply calculated vision of imperial order, showing that conquest alone wasn't enough. Control had to endure. Even the incomplete Dur-Sharrukin stood as a testament to his dreams of unity, structure, and unrivaled domination. Ultimately, Sargon's life was marked by achievement, but his death was a reminder that even the mightiest rulers could not escape the limits of human fragility. When Sennacherib took the throne in 705 BCE, the empire was grappling with uncertainty. His father, Sargon II, had died in battle, an ignoble and troubling end that cast doubt on the gods' favor over Assyria. Sennacherib wasted no time addressing these concerns. He ruled with a combination of fierce military campaigns and monumental building projects, reshaping both his empire and his legacy in a way that would leave a mark on history. Volatile and bold, Sennacherib's reign would come to embody both the heights and the risks of Assyrian power. His most famous campaign came in 701 BCE when he turned his forces toward the rebellious kingdom of Judah. At its heart was Jerusalem, ruled by King Hezekiah, who had refused to pay his tribute. According to Sennacherib's own inscriptions, he besieged the city and shut up Hezekiah like a caged bird. Assyrian forces overwhelmed Judah's fortified cities, leaving a path of destruction in their wake. But despite the impassable odds, Jerusalem itself was never taken. The reasons remain debated. Some accounts suggest Hezekiah secured his survival through an immense tribute payment to Sennacherib, offering silver, gold, and treasures stripped from the temple in Jerusalem. Others, including the Hebrew Bible, attribute the sudden withdrawal to divine intervention in the form of a plague. Regardless, Sennacherib left a clear message. Rebellion against Assyria came with devastating consequences. But no act of vengeance defined Sennacherib's fury more than his treatment of Babylon. Babylonia had posed a near-constant challenge to Assyrian kings, defying their control through rebellions and alliances with Elam. Rather than managing the region with the usual concessions, Sennacherib escalated. In 689 BCE, after yet another rebellion, he made a decision that shocked even his own people. Sennacherib ordered the complete destruction of Babylon. He sacked the city, looted its treasures, and razed its temples to the ground, an act of sacrilege almost unheard of in Mesopotamian history. To cement its ruin, he diverted the Euphrates River, flooding the wreckage and making the city uninhabitable. For Sennacherib, Babylon was no longer a symbol of prestige to incorporate, it was an enemy to erase. This extreme action, however, would haunt his legacy, as many in his empire viewed it as a dangerous affront to the gods. If his campaigns reflected his fierce will, his architectural projects demonstrated his ambition. Sennacherib abandoned his father's capital, Dur-Sharrukin, and transformed Nineveh into a sprawling urban center that merged defense, sophistication, and spectacle. The city's crown jewel was the Palace Without Rival, a massive complex adorned with intricate reliefs showing Assyrian victories, the king's power, and the gods' favor. These images weren't decoration. They were propaganda carved into stone, meant to inspire awe among subjects and visitors alike. Sennacherib's vision for Nineveh extended far beyond palaces. He revolutionized the city's infrastructure, constructing an intricate canal system to supply water from distant mountains. One of his most impressive achievements was the construction of the aqueduct at Jerwan, a 17-kilometer engineering project that diverted water across valleys and into Nineveh. Inscriptions on the aqueduct boasted of Sennacherib's mastery over nature, emphasizing his divinely sanctioned ability to reshape the land. Remarkably, this system was so advanced that modern engineers studied its designs when Iraq developed its water infrastructure in the 20th century. Despite his achievements, Sennacherib's reign ended in chaos. In 681 BCE, he was assassinated, likely by two of his own sons. Many believe this act of betrayal stemmed from his harsh policies, particularly his treatment of Babylon, which may have deeply alienated parts of the empire. His death marked the abrupt conclusion of a rule defined by unmatched ambition, fierce wrath, and striking innovation. Sennacherib left an empire transformed but dangerously volatile, its fate increasingly tied to the fragility of its ruling dynasty. Nineveh, once a modest settlement dedicated to the goddess Ishtar, underwent a dramatic transformation in the 7th century BCE, becoming the shining capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire under King Sennacherib. When he chose it as his imperial center, Nineveh was no longer an ordinary city. It became the heart of Assyrian ambition, a symbol of their power and unparalleled reach. At its peak, Nineveh was not only the largest city in the empire, but possibly the largest in the entire world. Estimates suggest over 100,000 people lived in the sprawling metropolis, surrounded by a monumental urban landscape of palaces, temples, gardens, and wide boulevards that made a statement of dominance unlike anything seen before. The scale of Sennacherib's rebuilding effort was unprecedented. His palace without rival, famous for its immensity, boasted more than 80 rooms and was carefully designed to awe anyone who set foot inside. The palace's walls were covered with intricate stone reliefs depicting the king's greatest triumphs, sieges, tributes from conquered lands, and even his lion hunting prowess. But these reliefs weren't just art for admiration. They were propaganda, crafted to ensure every visitor, whether a foreign dignitary or a local subject, left with a clear understanding. Assyria's king ruled by the will of the gods and was unstoppable on the battlefield. The city's defenses mirrored its ambition. Nineveh's outer limits were defined by massive walls stretching 7.5 miles around its perimeter, fortified with defensive towers and imposing gates. But protection and practicality aside, these walls served a greater purpose. They proclaimed Assyria's dominance to all who stood beyond them. Guarding the gates and palace entrances were colossal winged bulls called lamassu, carved from single blocks of stone. Human-headed, with the bodies of bulls and large wings, these statues symbolized divine protection and authority. Each one weighed over 40 tons, yet they were transported and placed as if physics itself bent to the will of Assyrian engineers. They served as both protectors of the city and psychological weapons, intimidating visitors before they even entered. Sennacherib's modernization of Nineveh extended beneath its surface and into its surrounding geography. One of the city's greatest achievements was the expansion of an intricate canal and aqueduct system. The most famous of these was the Jerwan Aqueduct, constructed to carry water from distant mountain springs directly into the city. Inscribed on the aqueduct was Sennacherib's own declaration of its completion, boasting of his power to harness and control nature itself. This system not only brought water for drinking and irrigation, but created lush gardens within the city. Some even suggest these innovations inspired later descriptions of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, though attributed elsewhere. Despite its grandeur, Nineveh's location carried inherent vulnerabilities. Unlike many ancient capitals, it lacked significant natural defenses, relying instead on the strength of its armies and the terror its name inspired. This reputation worked for decades, dissuading rebellion and external threats. Yet this reliance on fear and military might left Nineveh dangerously exposed in times of instability. Within a century of its peak, that vulnerability would lead to its catastrophic downfall. Nineveh's legend extended far beyond its physical ruins. The Greek historian Herodotus likely heard embellished tales of its splendor, perpetuating its fame in the ancient world. Later, Nineveh would be remembered in the Hebrew Bible as a city of sin and arrogance, cursed to fall under divine wrath. This mythologized version symbolized hubris punished by higher forces, a story mirrored in the fiery destruction of the city in 612 BCE. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered Nineveh's ruins in the 19th century, the sheer scale of what lay buried astonished them. Among the rubble, they discovered more than 20,000 cuneiform tablets, including texts from the famed Library of Ashurbanipal. For decades, Nineveh had been thought a legend exaggerated in ancient texts, but its rediscovery transformed understanding of Mesopotamian history. What had been dismissed as myth was revealed to be real, a city that once ruled the ancient world, only to vanish in fire and memory. Esarhaddon rose to the throne of Assyria in 681 BCE under violent and chaotic circumstances. His father, Sennacherib, had been assassinated in a conspiracy orchestrated by two of Esarhaddon's brothers, but the young prince outmaneuvered them in the ensuing power struggle. Marching from his post in the western provinces with a loyal army, he defeated his rivals and claimed the throne. His rule began amid this dangerous backdrop, but Esarhaddon quickly proved he possessed not only military skill, but also a talent for diplomacy and governance that would define his reign. Unlike his father, whose reign was marked by relentless aggression, Esarhaddon adopted a more balanced approach to rule. He was no stranger to military campaigns. He coupled them with efforts to stabilize and rebuild regions devastated by earlier wars. One of the most symbolic acts of his reign was the reconstruction of Babylon, a city his father had ruthlessly destroyed just over a decade earlier. Esarhaddon declared himself not only a conqueror, but also a restorer, commissioning the rebuild of Babylon's temples, palaces, and civic structures. By doing so, he sought to mend the strained relationship between Assyria and Babylonia, tying Babylon closer to the empire while presenting himself as a pious leader under the gods' favor. However, Esarhaddon's ambition wasn't limited to Mesopotamia. In 674 BCE, he launched a bold campaign against Egypt, whose pharaohs had long meddled in Assyrian-controlled regions of the Levant. His first attempt met limited success, but he returned in 671 BCE with overwhelming force. This time, Esarhaddon marched directly into Egypt, capturing Memphis, the ancient capital, and forcing the pharaoh Taharka to flee south into Nubia. This victory was unprecedented. Esarhaddon became the first ruler from Mesopotamia to conquer Egypt, extending the Assyrian Empire's reach to the Nile. At its height, his empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and deep into Egyptian territory, forming one of the largest territories ever controlled by a single Mesopotamian ruler. Yet, this meteoric expansion exposed inherent weaknesses. The sheer size of the empire made logistics and administration increasingly difficult. Supplying vast armies across long distances strained resources, while governors in far-flung provinces often tested the limits of their loyalty. Rebellions, once isolated setbacks, began to flare up with alarming regularity in key regions like Egypt, Babylonia, and Anatolia. Esarhaddon faced the unenviable task of holding this sprawling empire together while its own weight threatened to pull it apart. As the stability of direct control became harder to maintain, Esarhaddon began to shift tactics. Instead of relying purely on military domination, he used alliances, treaties, and the placement of puppet kings to stabilize critical regions. This represented a subtle but important pivot in Assyria's strategies of governance and hinted at the cracks forming beneath the surface of its power. Esarhaddon was still a fearsome ruler, but even he recognized that conquest without sustainable control was a dangerous gamble. Intriguingly, Esarhaddon also focused on ensuring the long-term survival of his dynasty. He made his sons sign a unique set of loyalty oaths known as the Vassal Treaties of Esarhaddon. These elaborate agreements compelled the empire's elites to swear unbreakable allegiance to his designated heirs. The language of these treaties would later echo in biblical covenant texts, suggesting Esarhaddon's legal innovations left their mark far beyond the boundaries of Assyria. It was a calculated attempt to secure the future, though it revealed the growing anxiety over succession and stability. Esarhaddon's rule ultimately came to an abrupt end in 669 BCE. While preparing for yet another campaign in Egypt, he fell ill and died en route. Despite his earlier efforts to ensure a smooth transfer of power, his death unleashed another wave of infighting. Assyria's vast empire, already stretched thin, began to buckle under the strain of rebellions and internal discord. His campaigns and policies widened the empire's reach to its greatest extent, but at the cost of exposing its fragile foundations. Expansion had hit its political and logistical limits, a reality that would define the years that followed. A curious glimpse into Esarhaddon's reign comes from a surviving royal tablet that details how a lunar eclipse delayed one of his campaigns. Suspicious of the celestial omen, Esarhaddon consulted his astrologers, whose advice likely influenced his every move. Even at the height of his earthly power, the king bowed to the heavens, a reminder that even Assyria's most ambitious rulers lived in deference to forces beyond their control. Ashurbanipal, who reigned from 669 to roughly 631 BCE, was a paradoxical figure who embodied the heights of Assyrian power. On one hand, he orchestrated campaigns of staggering brutality, leaving cities in ruins and enemies mutilated in their wake. On the other, he stood as a cultural pioneer, carefully archiving the knowledge of his world in what would become one of history's greatest repositories of ancient texts. Few rulers have managed to blend savagery and scholarship as seamlessly as Ashurbanipal. What set Ashurbanipal apart from most every ancient king was his education. Unlike most rulers who relied on scribes to read, write, and interpret for them, Ashurbanipal was formally trained in Akkadian and Sumerian, the literary and administrative languages of Mesopotamia. He wasn't afraid to boast about it either. In one inscription, Ashurbanipal claimed he could not only interpret complex texts, but also correct mistakes made by his scribes. This rare combination of royal power and intellectual prowess gave him a unique edge. It wasn't just about ruling the Assyrian Empire. It was about understanding and preserving the knowledge that sustained it. His reign, however, was anything but peaceful. One of Ashurbanipal's most significant campaigns was against Elam, a longtime rival located in modern southwestern Iran. After years of tension with its defiant rulers, Ashurbanipal unleashed a devastating military offensive, culminating in the sack of Susa, the Elamite capital. Assyrian reliefs vividly depict this victory, showing captured spoils and brutal acts designed to terrorize any would-be resistors. On one relief, the severed head of the Elamite king is displayed suspended from a tree, an unmistakable warning to rivals. By breaking Elam's power, Ashurbanipal eliminated a key regional challenger and expanded Assyrian dominance further east. But Ashurbanipal's ambitions weren't confined to distant lands. He doubled down on his predecessor's conquests, quashing rebellions in critical regions like Egypt, Arabia, and even Babylonia. He maintained control with an intricate intelligence network, sending spies into distant territories to report back on potential uprisings or threats. This system wasn't just reactive. It allowed Ashurbanipal to anticipate trouble and eliminate it before rebellion could root. The sheer scale of his empire, stretching from the Nile to the Persian Gulf, presented logistical challenges, but Ashurbanipal's methods kept its structure intact, at least during his lifetime. Yet, his rule wasn't defined solely by war. Despite his fearsome reputation, Ashurbanipal presided over a cultural renaissance. No achievement highlighted this more than his establishment of the Great Library in Nineveh, which would later transform how scholars understood the ancient world. Ashurbanipal ordered the collection of thousands of cuneiform tablets on topics as varied as religion, law, medicine, and astronomy. Among his most famous finds was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest known work of literature. This preservation effort ensured that Mesopotamian knowledge survived long beyond the empire itself, buried in the ruins of his library for over 2,000 years. Even Ashurbanipal's personal exploits blurred the lines between reality and legend. According to his inscriptions, he once faced live lions in an arena, killing them with his bare hands, a spectacle designed to demonstrate not just physical bravery, but divine favor. Lions in Mesopotamian culture symbolized chaos, and Ashurbanipal's ability to subdue them reinforced his image as the god's chosen ruler, capable of imposing order on the wildest forces of nature. Still, his reign was not immune to turmoil. The greatest blow came from his own family. Ashurbanipal installed his brother, Shamash-shum-ukin, as king of Babylon to maintain stability in the southern reaches of the empire. But the arrangement proved disastrous. His brother eventually rebelled, plunging the empire into a brutal civil war. The conflict devastated southern Mesopotamia, and while Ashurbanipal emerged victorious, the scars it left on the empire would never fully heal. Internal fractures deepened, and as rebellion became harder to suppress, cracks in the Assyrian state began widening. Ashurbanipal's duality defined his legacy. He was a scholar who preserved his culture's greatest achievements, and a warrior who razed entire cities. His empire reached its final territorial limits under his rule, but his methods of control, however ruthless or organized, could only stave off decline temporarily. After his death, Assyria's cohesion faltered, but his library remained, a time capsule of a civilization that would outlive its conquerors. The Great Library of Ashurbanipal, nestled within the palaces of Nineveh, was unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. It wasn't just a collection of texts, it was a systematically organized repository of knowledge, centuries ahead of its time. Housing over 30,000 clay tablets inscribed in cuneiform, it recorded nearly every aspect of life and thought in Mesopotamia. The library preserved myths, religious rituals, legal codes, medicinal texts, astronomical calculations, and even correspondence. It was an archive as much as it was a statement, an embodiment of Mesopotamian intellectual heritage gathered in one place under the command of a remarkably literate king. Ashurbanipal didn't build this library by accident. He ordered scribes from across the empire to hunt down rare texts, copying and collecting them from older centers of learning like Babylon and Sumer. This effort wasn't just about preserving tradition, it was an assertion of power. By owning the written wisdom of the known world, Ashurbanipal claimed a lineage that tied him to the kings of ancient Sumer and Akkad, reinforcing his own legitimacy. More than that, the library served a practical function. Knowledge about the gods, the stars, and statecraft could be consulted directly, giving Ashurbanipal tools for decision-making and divine interpretation. Significantly, this endeavor wasn't motivated by altruism. These texts were treated like treasures to be guarded. One chilling inscription on a tablet warned, "Whoever removes this tablet, may all the gods who are found in this temple curse him." In a world where divine will guided earthly fate, such curses provided an early form of intellectual property protection. Removing knowledge from the library might not only anger the king, but also invite the wrath of the gods themselves. Some of the most profound works of ancient humanity were preserved in this archive, including the standard Babylonian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This was the first time the flood story, so famous today for its biblical parallels, was brought to light in modern history. The library also preserved lists of omens and astrological texts that revealed a sophisticated understanding of planetary movements, eclipses, and celestial events. These records show that Mesopotamian scholars could predict eclipses with surprising accuracy, a capacity that blended observation and divine interpretation in ways that shaped both science and superstitions. What makes the Great Library even more extraordinary is the way its contents survived destruction. When Nineveh fell to a combined force of Babylonian, Median, and Scythian armies in 612 BC, the once mighty city was sacked and burned. Palaces were destroyed, walls crumbled, and Assyria's empire was no more. Ironically, though, the very fire that destroyed Nineveh's structures saved Ashurbanipal's library. The clay tablets were baked in the intense heat, solidifying them and preserving their cuneiform inscriptions. While the empire perished, its knowledge endured, buried under layers of ash and rubble waiting to be rediscovered. That rediscovery came in the 19th century when archaeologists unearthed the ruins of Nineveh. Among the shattered palaces and toppled lamassu, they found stacks of cuneiform tablets. These curious inscriptions took decades to decode, but when finally understood, they unveiled a treasure trove of information about Mesopotamian history, mythology, and daily life. It was a stunning revelation, a window into an ancient world long thought lost, unlocked by Ashurbanipal's deliberate preservation of knowledge. What Ashurbanipal achieved through his library wasn't just a reflection of his thirst for wisdom, it was a final stand for cuneiform writing itself. The script, central to Mesopotamian civilization for thousands of years, would fall out of use in the centuries after Nineveh's destruction. The library's written legacy, however, survived the collapse of its creators, safeguarding Mesopotamia's contributions to human progress. At the very heart of Assyrian society was a belief system that placed the king at the center of both governance and the divine order. He wasn't just a political leader. He was the living embodiment of the god Ashur, the chief deity of the Assyrian pantheon. Every action he took, from expanding borders to erecting massive monuments, was seen as fulfilling Ashur's will. This divine authority underscored one crucial truth for the Assyrians. Loyalty to the king wasn't just a matter of politics, it was also a religious obligation. Failure to obey meant defying the cosmic balance itself, a concept that was reiterated in rituals, proclamations, and inscribed reliefs across the empire. Religion formed the backbone of Assyrian statecraft. The king not only governed the land, but also performed sacred duties. He conducted elaborate rituals to honor the gods, constructed omens before major decisions, and interpreted celestial events as divine communication. The belief in divine causality ran deep. Misfortune on the battlefield or a natural disaster wasn't viewed as bad luck, but as a sign of the god's displeasure. As a result, every military campaign began with ritual precision, whether it was sacrifices to ensure victory or the reading of entrails to predict outcomes. Even delays in military action sometimes stemmed from these religious practices. Assyrian kings relied on a cadre of priests, astrologers, and dream interpreters to guide their decisions, believing that ignoring the signals of the heavens could unleash chaos. This blend of divine mission and governance translated into an unmatched ability to use propaganda as a tool for control. The empire didn't just build its reputation through conquest on the battlefield, it was cemented in stone. Across Assyrian cities, monumental reliefs adorned palaces and temples, These depictions were anything but subtle. Towering images of kings slaying lions symbolized unmatched strength and dominance. Other carvings showcased long lines of defeated enemies, their hands bound or their cities ablaze. Publicly displayed, these served a dual purpose: to glorify the king's achievements and remind the population of the consequences of rebellion. Even statues of the gods reflected this message. They were dressed, fed, and cared for as if alive. Their presence in temples reiterated that Assyria's strength came not just from human rulers, but from divine sanction. To reinforce their cosmic authority over the population, the Assyrians undertook awe-inspiring construction projects. Temples and palaces weren't built solely for practical purposes. Every stone, mural, and inscription whispered or shouted messages of divine order. The king's right to rule was constantly proclaimed in the architecture itself. Many inscriptions proclaimed that the king ruled by the command of Ashur, driving home the notion that Assyrian governance wasn't mere administration, but a reflection of the god's will. These buildings also embodied an overwhelming sense of scale, designed to impress the divine as much as mortals. Walking into an Assyrian palace with its massive walls and endless imagery of royal power must have felt like stepping into a space that belonged to something beyond human comprehension. Fear was another tool that kept the social order intact. Assyria's infamous reputation for cruelty wasn't accidental, it was calculated. Public executions, torture, and even mass deportations weren't conducted in secrecy. They were spectacles. Flayed skins were nailed to walls, heads of enemies placed on stakes. These acts carried a grim message. Rebellion led to devastation, not just for individuals, but for entire populations. And so, Assyrian rulers ensured everyone understood the price of stepping out of line. Within this rigid and often brutal hierarchy, women played nuanced but important roles. Most remained within the domestic and religious spheres, yet high-ranking women, particularly royal consorts and priestesses, wielded significant influence. Some even managed vast temple estates, oversaw administrative activities, and issued decrees. Priestesses of Ishtar, for example, were often crucial figures, bridging gaps between divine worship and economic management. Their power may not have rivaled that of the king, but in their domains, they controlled vast resources and commanded respect. Oddly enough, the Assyrians even extended their rigid sense of hierarchy and order to their gods. Statues of deities were thought to embody the gods themselves through specific rituals. Once activated, these divine images weren't merely symbolic, but were treated as living beings. They received offerings, were ritually clothed, and were even consulted for guidance. Temples thus became not just houses of worship, but the literal dwelling places of gods, blending spiritual devotion with imperial propaganda. By intertwining the divine and the earthly, Assyria ensured that every aspect of daily life revolved around reinforcing its power. From breathtaking palaces to fearsome punishments, every corner of Assyrian society reflected a singular message. The king was chosen by the gods, the empire was shaped by their will, and resistance was both feudal and sacrilegious. In its twilight years, the Assyrian Empire, once the unshakable master of Mesopotamia, began to crumble, not from an onslaught of foreign armies, but from the cracks within its own foundation. The death of Ashurbanipal around 631 BCE left a gaping void where firm leadership once stood. Without a clear successor, rivalries among his heirs erupted, plunging the empire into chaos. Generals and governors who had once been held in check by the king's authority grew emboldened. They fragmented the cohesive structure of the state, acting as regional powers with little regard to the central government in Nineveh. The empire's carefully constructed system, one that had always thrived on martial dominance and absolute power at the top, began to implode under its own weight. This internal fragmentation couldn't have come at a worse time. Long held together by fear and the strength of its military machine, Assyria now lacked the resources to enforce its authority across its sprawling territory. The army, which had once coordinated conquests on a global scale, was overburdened. Stretched to its limits, it faced not one or two challenges, but countless rebellions erupting simultaneously across the empire. Soldiers mutinied as payments became inconsistent, morale plummeted, and supplies dwindled. Campaigns to suppress unrest became increasingly costly, forcing the empire to spread its resources thinner still. What had once been a fearsome juggernaut became an overstressed and underfunded force, struggling to just stay afloat. Babylon, always a thorn in the side of Assyria, seized this opportunity to rise again. Under the leadership of Nabopolassar, an Assyrian military ally turned enemy, Babylon declared its independence. Nabopolassar directly challenged Assyria's authority and unified local resistance. Perhaps more threatening than Babylon's rebellion, however, was Nabopolassar's alliance with the Medes to the north. Together, these forces represented a formidable coalition, one that would later deal fatal blows to the empire itself. Here lay Assyria's greatest vulnerability. The enemies it had fought to suppress for centuries were now finding common cause in its decline. Economic consequences compounded the political and military failures. Trade, long a vital artery of imperial wealth, began to dry up as routes once maintained by the Assyrians fell into enemy hands. Grain shortages led to famine, exacerbating unrest among the populace. Even the temples, central not only to worship but also taxation and administrative stability, began to falter. With incomes from tribute and trade collapsing, many religious rituals were delayed or abandoned altogether, a terrifying omen for a society that linked divine favor to survival. For the Assyrians, the disruption of these divine ceremonies wasn't just a cultural catastrophe, it was a sign that their gods might have turned against them. Symbolically, the empire's decline was perhaps captured best by the relocation of the royal court. Nineveh, the iconic capital that had once dazzled the ancient world with its towering palaces and sculpted reliefs, was no longer a safe or practical seat of power. Kings in the final years were forced to rule from provincial cities like Haran, far from the grandeur and central significance of their former capital. The move was more than a logistical adjustment. It announced to the world, and perhaps to the Assyrians themselves, that the empire was now steadily retreating into survival mode. Even as the situation worsened, Assyrian astrologers and priests continued their age-old practices of studying omens. Among the intriguing predictions that have survived, one spoke of a fish swallowing a man at a city gate. For a society that had long intertwined prophecy and governance, such visions offered both terror and fleeting hope. Yet, prophecy alone couldn't stabilize an empire unraveling at every level. Local leaders acted with increasing autonomy, turning what had once been an intricately controlled empire into an unstable mosaic of rival factions and besieged cities. In this state of disarray, Assyria faced the ultimate test. With governors asserting independence, armies faltering, and resources vanishing, the empire stood on the precipice. What had once been the most fearsome power in the ancient world now appeared fragmented and exposed, marking the final stages of an empire unmade as much by its own hand as by external foes. In 612 BCE, The Assyrian Empire, once feared as the pinnacle of power in the ancient world, faced its greatest reckoning. A coalition of longtime adversaries, the Babylonians and the Medes, joined forces and launched a full-scale invasion of the Assyrian heartland. Their target wasn't just any city, it was Nineveh, the empire's glittering capital and a symbol of its unmatched dominance. For decades, Nineveh's massive fortifications and fabled wealth had stood as a testament to Assyria's supremacy. Now, however, those same colossal walls became the focus of a relentless assault meant to break the empire's spirit and power in one devastating blow. The siege stretched on for months. Nineveh, with its immense walls, some which reached up to 100 feet in height, was seen by many as untouchable. But the coalition forces surrounded the city, cutting off resources and waiting for the moment to strike. According to some accounts, nature may have played a role in the city's downfall. Scholars suggest that unusually heavy rains could have weakened the foundations of part of the mud brick walls, causing sections to collapse and allowing the attackers to breach what seemed impenetrable. As the coalition armies poured into the city, chaos erupted. Nineveh, known for its grandeur and order, succumbed to fire, looting, and slaughter. The invincible capital lay in ruin within days, erasing centuries of imperial prestige almost overnight. The destruction of Nineveh didn't end with fire and blood. It was so complete, so thorough, that it silenced the Assyrian record itself. Assyrian tablets and inscriptions, once a cornerstone of propaganda and historical documentation, come to an abrupt halt after this fateful year. The physical devastation turned Nineveh into a ghost, its ruins swallowed by sand and time. For over 2 millennia, its location was forgotten, and later historians even debated whether the city had ever really existed. But contemporary sources outside Assyria, like the Babylonian Chronicle, record the grim reality. Turned into ruin hills and heaps of debris is how the Chronicle describes Nineveh, a chilling phrase that captures the complete obliteration of what was once one of the ancient world's most magnificent cities. Nineveh's fall carried immense symbolic weight for those who had suffered under Assyrian dominance. Babylon and Media, long crushed and exploited by Assyrian campaigns, transformed Nineveh's defeat into a story of triumphant justice. Biblical prophets, such as Nahum and Zephaniah, echo this sentiment, describing the fall as divine retribution. Nahum proclaimed, "The lion's den is no more," likening the destruction of Nineveh to a predator being brought to ruin. Over time, the city became a cautionary tale, proof that even the most powerful empires can fall when arrogance and cruelty reach their peak. Yet, even with Nineveh in ashes, pockets of Assyrian resistance persisted. Nobles and generals who escaped the carnage regrouped in Haran, continuing to resist their enemies for a time. But without Nineveh, Assyria had lost more than its capital. It had lost its heart. Strategically and symbolically, its defeat marked the end of an era, one defined by military dominance, terror, and ambition. Nineveh had been more than a city. It embodied an entire worldview built on divine kingship and imperial conquest. With its fall, that worldview crumbled. When the ruins of Nineveh were rediscovered by Austin Henry Layard in the 1840s, the scale of the site astonished archaeologists, but locals had already woven their own myths around it. Many believe the ruins to be the Palace of Nimrud, connecting the fall of Nineveh to biblical figures and stories of punishment. The shattered remains of the great city became more than just an archaeological curiosity. They became evidence of the fragility of power. The fall of Nineveh was not just a military catastrophe, It marked the end of Assyria's dominance and the collapse of its identity as an eternal empire. What was once unthinkable had become reality, as one of history's most powerful civilizations was reduced, quite literally, to dust and legend. After Nineveh fell in 612 BCE, the once mighty Assyrian Empire became a shadow of its former self. Fleeing the charred ruins of their capital, the remnants of the royal family, led by Ashur-uballit II, the empire's self-declared new king, regrouped in Haran, a trading hub precariously positioned in the empire's western territories. But Haran was no Nineveh. It lacked the towering walls and symbolic power of the former capital. Instead, it became a last refuge, a flickering light of Assyrian rule, struggling to hold back the looming darkness. Ashur-uballit II faced an impossible task, rallying the remnants of an empire that, for all intents and purposes, was already shattered. If that weren't enough, Ashur-uballit II had almost no allies. His only significant support came from Egypt, which entered the fray not out of allegiance, but out of calculated self-interest. Under Pharaoh Necho II, Egypt feared Babylonian dominance over the Near East and sought to keep Assyria alive as a buffer state. However, Egypt's assistance, while helpful, came too little too late. By 610 BCE, the Babylonians, now united under Nabopolassar, and the Medes, fierce newcomers to regional power, turned their sights on Haran. Together, they marched an overwhelming force to seize the last stronghold of the Assyrian regime. Despite fierce resistance, the city fell. Haran was sacked, its holdouts scattered, and the ancient city was removed from the political map. Ashur-uballit II, however, escaped. Somehow, against these odds, this last Assyrian king managed to stay in command of his dwindling forces. Over the next 5 years, he maneuvered through increasingly narrow options, clinging to the hope of reclaiming his lost empire. His persistence culminated in one final audacious stand, the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE. Positioned near the Euphrates River, Carchemish was a vital crossroads between the collapsing Assyrian West and the rising power of Babylon. Ashur-uballit faced Nabopolassar's forces here, bolstered once again by Egyptian support. But at Carchemish, the final chapter of the Assyrian Empire truly began to close. Leading the Babylonian charge was Crown Prince Nebuchadnezzar, the man who would later become one of history's most iconic rulers and the builder of Babylon's Hanging Gardens, though here he was simply the general who shattered Assyria's last chance. The battle was decisive and devastating. Assyrian forces, alongside their Egyptian allies, were annihilated. Whatever remained of Assyria's military might evaporated in the chaos of Carchemish. With Ashur-uballit II's defeat, no ruler would ever again claim the title King of Assyria, and no army would ever march under the banner of Ashur to stake a claim for their empire. The results of the battle rippled far beyond Assyria. Babylon emerged as the dominant power in Mesopotamia, strengthened by their alliance with the Medes. Soon, Babylon's influence would stretch across the Near East, establishing a new political order in the ashes of what had once been Assyria's domain. This realignment affected more than geography. It reshaped the cultural and economic currents of the region, creating a foundation that later empires, like the Persians, would build upon. Carchemish's significance was not lost on later generations. It appears in the Bible, particularly in the book of Jeremiah 46:2, as a moment of prophetic importance, marking a divine judgment and the fall of a once proud empire. This intersection of political history and spiritual imagination underscores how Assyria's collapse resonated on levels beyond military failure. Though the ruin of Assyria saw some survivors scatter into enclaves, the empire as a unified force ceased to exist after Carchemish. The end wasn't quiet or gradual. It came like a hammer blow, one last clash before oblivion. These final moments sealed Assyria's legacy as both a cautionary tale and a towering force that had shaped the ancient world, even in its final breaths. After Assyria's collapse, its legacy drifted into silence. By the time of the Greeks and Romans, the once dominant empire had faded into little more than fragments of distant memory. Its capital cities, Nineveh and Ashur, were abandoned, swallowed by time and the sands of northern Mesopotamia. Even their names vanished from human memory. For centuries, knowledge of Assyria survived only through the lens of biblical warnings or occasional references, painting the empire as a harsh and cautionary tale. To most of the ancient and medieval world, it was hardly more than a ghost, cloaked in the idea of divine judgment and forgotten behind its shattered walls. That changed dramatically in the 19th century, when Western explorers began poking through the deserts of Iraq. They noticed unusual mounds scattered across the landscape, gigantic, seemingly natural hills left undisturbed for millennia. Most locals assumed they were the remains of ancient Persian or Arab settlements, their true origin long lost. What no one realized at first was that these unassuming rises in the land were actually the ruins of Assyria's fabled cities. Beneath the earth lay the remnants of the empire's former capitals, waiting to be rediscovered after more than 2,000 years. The breakthrough came in the 1840s, thanks to the pioneering efforts of Austen Henry Layard, a young Englishman driven by curiosity and ambition. Layard set his sights on two major ruins: Nimrud, the city built centuries earlier by Shalmaneser I, and Nineveh, once the jewel of Sennacherib's reign. What he found was nothing short of extraordinary. At Nimrud, Layard unearthed the remains of grand palace walls, which were covered in intricate stone reliefs depicting Assyrian kings, conquests, and religious ceremonies. But it was the colossal Lamassu statues at Nineveh that truly took Europe by storm. These human-headed, winged bulls stood guard at palace gates in ancient Assyria, each carved from a single block of stone and weighing dozens of tons. To the Victorians, enthralled by tales of biblical cities like Nineveh, the sheer scale of these statues was almost unbelievable. At first, even Layard didn't realize the true significance of what he had uncovered. Based on popular biblical accounts, he thought he had stumbled upon cities built by Nimrud, the legendary figure often linked to the Tower of Babel. It wasn't until scholars began studying the cuneiform inscriptions found in the ruins that the truth of Assyria's identity began to emerge. These texts, written in neat, wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets, turned out to be the official records of Assyria's kings. Deciphering the script, a feat achieved by figures like Henry Rawlinson, revealed previously untold stories of rulers like Ashurbanipal, Sennacherib, and Tiglath-Pileser III. For the first time in over 2 millennia, the voices of Assyria began to speak clearly again. As Layard shipped his findings back to Europe, they became cultural sensations. The artifacts, particularly the Lamassu sculptures and the carved panels, arrived in places like the British Museum, where they were put on display to wide public interest. For many Victorian viewers, these relics from Assyria seemed almost otherworldly. Fun fact, some people thought the statues were hoaxes or mythological fabrications, unable to grasp how such massive works of art could have been produced in ancient times. But for archaeologists and historians, these discoveries completely altered the field. Assyria's rediscovery didn't just restore knowledge about one lost empire. It reshaped how scholars understood the ancient Near East. It challenged biblical chronology, revealed the origins of written language, and even changed concepts of what an empire could be. The ruins of Assyria, long lost under layers of destruction and neglect, transformed through these finds. What had once symbolized dominance through war and terror now stood as a testament to memory and survival. Today, the treasures of Assyria live on in museums and archives, a final echo of a civilization once thought gone forever. The fall of the empire in 612 BCE marked the end of Assyria's political dominance, but not the disappearance of its people. Despite centuries of conquest and cultural shifts, the Assyrians endured, a distinct group rooted in their ancient Mesopotamian heritage. Today, modern Assyrians trace their lineage back to those early days, preserving a cultural identity that has withstood one of history's longest tests of time. Central to this identity is the continued use of Neo-Aramaic, a distinct linguistic descendant of the language spoken during the height of the empire. Many Assyrians also remain tied to Christianity, a faith they adopted early in its history, blending its practices with long-standing cultural traditions. Language, liturgy, and oral memory became the connective threads tying them back to their ancient ancestors. In the centuries after the empire's fall, Assyrians lived under a succession of foreign rulers. They survived the Babylonian revival, the rise of Persia, and the Macedonian conquests that etched Greek culture across the region. Later, they became subjects of the Romans, Arabs, Ottomans, and eventually modern nation-states. Through it all, Assyrians endured as a minority group, often marginalized and pushed to the edges of society. Yet, they were never erased. Remarkably, some Assyrian villages in northern Iraq and southeastern Turkey retained ancient place names, a living echo of an ancient geography. These same communities also passed down oral histories that connected the ruins nearby to their ancestral cities, keeping fragments of Assyrian identity alive. The early Christian era marked a period of Assyrian prominence in a different form. As pioneers of theology, medicine, and intellectual life, they played a vital role in the spread of Christianity throughout the Middle East and beyond. The Church of the East, predominantly Assyrian, was instrumental in taking Christian teachings as far as Persia, Central Asia, and even China and India. This influence is evidenced by inscriptions and documents linking Assyrian missionaries to communities along the Silk Road. Their ability to merge local traditions with Christian practices helped create an enduring legacy of resilience in the face of cultural shifts. This history, however, was not without immense challenges. In the early 20th century, Assyrians experienced one of the darkest chapters of their modern history during the Ottoman genocide campaigns, known collectively as the Sayfo. Between 1915 and 1920, tens of thousands of Assyrians were massacred, and entire communities were uprooted. Forced into exile, many fled to new lands, creating the start of a widespread diaspora that now stretches from Europe to Australia and North America. Even in the decades that followed, Assyrians faced oppression in Iraq and Syria, often caught in the middle of political and ethnic upheavals that threatened their communities and heritage. Despite this, Assyrians today continue to honor their extraordinary history. One enduring tradition is the celebration of Akitu, the Assyrian New Year, held every April. With roots dating back over 4 millennia, Akitu connects modern Assyrians to Imperial-era festivals that celebrated renewal and the rebirth of the land. It serves not only as a cultural celebration, but a powerful reminder of their survival and connection to the past. In diaspora communities, festivals like Akitu and the continued use of Neo-Aramaic keep the thread of Assyrian identity alive. Globally, millions of Assyrians remain deeply committed to preserving their heritage. Activism around cultural recognition, linguistic preservation, and historical restitution has become central to their modern narrative. For communities in the Middle East, challenges persist. Many ancestral villages face existential threats from conflict and displacement. Yet, their story endures, not as one of conquest, but survival. Where palaces once stood, memory fills the void. From Nineveh to distant continents, Assyrians carry forward a legacy not built by armies, but rooted in resilience and unyielding identity. From a city on the Tigris, Assyria rose to dominate the ancient world, brutal in war, brilliant in culture. Its legacy lives on in stone, script, and memory. History like this still shapes us today. What other empires wait to be uncovered? Subscribe for more lost worlds and hidden stories.